For more than a century, scientists believed they had polar bears figured out. Here was an animal built by evolution for one purpose and one purpose only: survival on Arctic sea ice, thick fur for insulation, black skin underneath to soak up whatever sunlight reached it, a layer of fat up to 4 inches deep, massive paws built like snowshoes to spread weight across thin ice. Every textbook told the same story: a perfect predator shaped entirely by frozen ocean water. Take away the ice and you take away the bear. That was the assumption for decades. It was taught in classrooms, repeated in documentaries, and used as the single clearest symbol of what climate change would destroy first. Then researchers went looking in a place nobody expected to find anything new, and what they found didn't just add a footnote to the polar bear story, it rewrote it. There's another detail most people outside the research world never hear, and it makes the old assumptions even more understandable. Polar bear fur isn't actually white. Each individual hair is hollow and pigment-free, essentially a clear tube that scatters light the same way snow does, which is why the coat appears white or sometimes yellowish depending on the season and the angle of the sun. Underneath that hollow fur is skin that is jet black, built to absorb every bit of heat from sunlight that manages to reach it through the coat. For decades, this combination was held up as close to a perfect case study in specialized evolution, an animal engineered down to the level of individual hair structure for one narrow climate and nothing else. That level of specialization is part of why the idea of polar bears having any real flexibility left in their biology seemed almost contradictory. You don't expect an animal this finely tuned to one environment to suddenly show signs of adapting to a different one within a handful of generations. To understand how big a shift this is, you have to understand how locked in the old picture really was. Polar bears split off from brown bears several 100,000 years ago, and in evolutionary terms, they changed almost impossibly fast. Within roughly 100,000 years, an animal that once foraged on land like its brown bear ancestors became a marine mammal in almost every practical sense. A bear that spends most of its life on frozen seawater, hunting seals through breathing holes, swimming for hours between ice flows, and building its entire yearly rhythm around the freeze and thaw of the Arctic Ocean. Scientists have long pointed to this as one of the fastest cases of large mammal adaptation ever documented. The genome tells the story too. Mutations in genes tied to fat metabolism let polar bears handle a diet almost entirely made of blubber without the heart disease that would kill most other mammals eating the same way. Other genetic changes altered pigmentation, cardiovascular function, and how the body handles cold stress. It was, by every measure researchers had, a textbook case of an animal fused to a single narrow environment. And that is exactly why polar bears became the poster species for climate collapse. If your entire biology is built around sea ice, and sea ice is disappearing, the math seemed brutally simple. Satellite data has shown Arctic sea ice shrinking at roughly 12% per decade. Some population models projected that 2 out of every 3 polar bears alive today could be gone by 2050, with the species facing functional extinction before the end of the century. Nature documentaries built entire narratives around a starving bear stranded on a shrinking ice floe, and for good reason. Polar bears need sea ice to hunt seals. They're almost exclusive food source, and most populations simply cannot fast long enough to survive an ice-free Arctic summer that keeps getting longer every year. This was the consensus, not a guess, not speculation, but a conclusion built on genetics, field data, and decades of tracking. Polar bears were an animal with nowhere left to adapt to because they had already adapted as far as they possibly could, into an evolutionary dead end shaped entirely by ice. There's also a piece of polar bear history that rarely makes it into American classrooms, and it quietly hints at how much scientists still don't know about this species. Ancient DNA pulled from a roughly 100,000-year-old polar bear jawbone revealed extensive hybridization between polar bears and brown bears during a past warm interglacial period, a stretch of Earth's history almost as warm as what climate models project for the coming century. That ancient genome carries clear traces of brown bear ancestry mixed back in, evidence that when the ice retreated dramatically in the deep past, these two species didn't simply stay separated in their own lanes. They overlapped, interbred, and exchanged genetic material in ways that blurred the line between them for a time. It's a reminder that the rigid species boundary most people picture, polar bear on one side, brown bear on the other, has not always been as fixed in nature as it appears in a museum exhibit. The first crack in that certainty came from a place almost nobody was studying, the remote mountainous fjords of southeast Greenland. This region is so difficult to access that for years it was essentially a blank spot on the polar bear research map. Local Inuit communities had long known bears lived there, but scientific surveys were sparse. In the early 2020s, a team led by polar scientist Kristen Ladra at the University of Washington finally combined decades of GPS, collar tracking, tissue samples, and helicopter surveys to build a real picture of what was happening in that corner of the Arctic. What they found stunned them. Sea ice in southeast Greenland disappears for more than 250 days a year, far longer than the roughly 100 to 180 day fasting window scientists believed was the outer limit polar bears could survive without regular access to seals. By every existing model, bears in this region should not have been able to sustain a population. Yet there they were, an estimated few hundred individuals, not just surviving but reproducing, and genetically distinct enough from every other known polar bear population that researchers realized they were looking at something that had never been formally documented. The secret turned out to be ice, just not the kind anyone was looking for. Instead of relying on frozen seawater, these bears had adapted to hunt from glacial melange, a churned, jumbled mix of freshwater ice chunks that calved directly off Greenland's ice sheet into narrow fjords. Massive glaciers dump broken ice into the water constantly, creating a rough, floating platform that never fully melts away the way sea ice does. The bears learned to stalk seals from this freshwater ice instead, essentially building an entirely different survival strategy in a place where the old rulebook should have made survival impossible. It was the first time scientists had ever documented polar bears using frozen freshwater rather than frozen seawater as their primary hunting platform for most of the year. This alone was a significant discovery, suggesting that certain glacier-heavy coastlines in Greenland, Svalbard, and parts of northern Canada might act as small but crucial climate refuges, places where isolated bear populations could hold on even as the broader Arctic ice sheet retreats. One researcher not involved in the original study, a polar bear specialist, Albert, with the United States Geological Survey in Alaska, described the discovery as a genuinely compelling case for a distinct subpopulation, pointing to the bear's unique genetics, their unusual movement patterns, and a hunting strategy that had simply never been documented anywhere else in the species range. It was, in his words, the kind of finding that reshapes how researchers think about where polar bears might still be able to hang on as the broader Arctic transforms. But it also raised a much bigger question that researchers couldn't ignore. If one isolated population had already found a workaround nobody predicted, what else about polar bear biology had been assumed to be fixed that actually wasn't? That question led directly to the discovery that has genuinely reshaped how scientists think about this species, one announced only recently and still not widely known outside research circles. Building on the genetic samples collected from those same Greenland populations, a team at the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom decided to look deeper than DNA sequence alone. They wanted to know not just what genes polar bears had, but which genes were actively switched on or off, and how that activity differed between bears living in the colder northeast of Greenland and the noticeably warmer southeast, home to those same freshwater ice specialists. Using a technique called RNA sequencing, which captures which genes are actively being read and used by cells rather than simply cataloging the genome itself, the researchers compared genetic activity in bears from both regions. What they found was activity in so-called jumping genes, formerly known as transposons, sections of DNA that can physically move to new locations within the genome, copying and reinserting themselves elsewhere. For a long time, jumping genes were dismissed by much of the scientific community as junk, leftover genetic debris with no real function. That view has been steadily overturned in recent years, and this study became one of the clearest examples yet of why. In the warmer southeastern population, the bears surviving on glacial ice instead of sea ice, these jumping genes were dramatically more active than in their northern relatives. And critically, that heightened activity clustered around genes tied to heat stress response, metabolism, and aging. In other words, the parts of the genome most connected to surviving a warmer, less predictable environment were the exact regions being reshuffled and rewritten in real time. Researchers described it as the polar bear equivalent of an emergency genetic response, the animal's own DNA restructuring itself under environmental pressure within a population that has likely only been isolated for a few hundred years, an evolutionary blink of an eye. This matters enormously because it had generally been assumed that meaningful adaptation in large, slow-reproducing mammals like polar bears would take thousands of generations, far too long to matter in the face of rapid climate change happening over decades rather than millennia. What this research suggests instead is that under the right pressure, a mammal's genome can begin actively reorganizing itself within a remarkably short window, using mechanisms most scientists assumed were essentially dormant background noise in the DNA of large animals. The lead researcher on the study, Dr. Alice Godden, described it in stark terms, calling it a desperate survival mechanism against melting sea ice, and noting that this small, unique group of bears is essentially rewriting parts of its own genome in real time just to keep pace with a changing world. It is being framed by some researchers as the first clearly documented case of rising temperatures directly driving measurable genetic change in a wild mammal population, a finding significant enough that it was published in the peer-reviewed journal Mobile DNA in December 2025. None of this means polar bears as a species are suddenly safe. That caveat matters, and researchers involved in the work have been careful to repeat it. The vast majority of the roughly 26,000 polar bears alive today still depend on traditional sea ice, and that ice is still vanishing at a pace most populations cannot adapt to in time. The Southeast Greenland bears are a small, genetically narrow group, numbering only in the low hundreds, living in a very specific geographic pocket that isn't available to most of the Arctic's bear populations. Their glacial ice refuge exists because of a particular combination of fjord shape, glacier size, and ice sheet geography that simply doesn't exist across most of the polar bear's range. This is not a blueprint that will save every population, and extinction projections for the species as a whole have not fundamentally changed because of this discovery. What has changed is something more foundational. The assumption that polar bears were a finished evolutionary product permanently locked into one narrow survival strategy with no capacity left to adjust. Scientists, us studying a completely separate Svalbard population, added another unexpected wrinkle to this picture recently, finding bears there thriving despite dramatic, well-documented sea ice loss in the region. Researchers openly admitted surprise at just how healthy these bears looked, theorizing that shrinking ice patches may actually be concentrating seal populations in smaller areas, inadvertently making hunting more efficient for the bears that remain. One lead researcher put it simply, that these findings suggest polar bears may need less sea ice to survive than previously believed, though he was careful to add that this in no way predicts how the species will fare as warming continues to intensify in the years ahead. What made the Svalbard result so striking to the team studying it was how directly it contradicted their own expectations going in. This was a group of scientists who had personally watched sea ice cover collapse in that region year after year, expecting each new survey to show the bears struggling more than the last. Instead, they found well-fed, healthy animals described by one researcher on the project with a phrase that stuck, that a fat bear is a healthy bear. The theory now being explored is almost counterintuitive, that as sea ice breaks into smaller, more scattered patches, it may actually concentrate seals into tighter areas rather than simply removing the bear's hunting grounds altogether, inadvertently making some hunts more efficient, even as the total amount of ice keeps shrinking. Researchers stress this is not evidence the Arctic is fine. It's evidence that the relationship between ice loss and bear survival is more complicated and more regionally specific than a single simple graph can capture. Put all of these threads together, the hidden freshwater ice hunters of southeast Greenland, the genome actively rewriting itself under heat stress, and a Svalbard population defying expectations, and a very different picture starts to emerge. Polar bears were never quite the single rigid product of one frozen environment that textbooks described. They were always an animal capable of more flexibility than anyone gave them credit for. It simply took a warming planet and scientists willing to look in places nobody had bothered studying before to reveal it. That doesn't erase the danger this species is facing. If anything, it reframes it. This isn't a story about an animal that is broken and doomed the moment its one habitat disappears. It's a story about a species scrambling genetically and behaviorally in real time to avoid that fate, using survival tools inside its own DNA that scientists didn't even know it had access to. Whether that scrambling will be enough for the species as a whole remains an open and genuinely uncertain question, one that depends far more on how quickly the Arctic continues to warm than on how resourceful individual populations of bears can be. But the next time someone tells you polar bears are simply built for the ice and nothing else, you'll know that isn't quite the whole story anymore. Somewhere in the fjords of southeast Greenland, a few hundred bears are quietly proving that even one of the most specialized animals on Earth still has surprises left in its genes. And there's a broader lesson tucked inside this story too, one that reaches beyond polar bears entirely. For years, jumping genes across the animal kingdom were treated as irrelevant leftovers, background clutter in genomes that scientists assumed didn't do much of anything. This research is part of a growing wave of evidence suggesting that assumption was wrong, and not just for bears. If a mammal as large, as slow to reproduce, and as narrowly specialized as a polar bear can show measurable genetic rewiring in response to environmental stress within a few hundred years, it raises real questions about what other species, quietly, without anyone documenting it yet, might be doing the exact same thing right now. Science has a habit of treating its biggest conclusions as finished business, especially when those conclusions get repeated in enough textbooks and documentaries. The polar bear was supposed to be one of those settled cases, a symbol so simple it barely needed further study, an animal built for ice and nothing else. It took scientists willing to fly into some of the most remote, hard-to-reach fjords on the planet, and a genetic technique that didn't even exist in its current form a decade ago to prove that even the most famous case study in climate vulnerability still had a chapter nobody had read yet.